Honourable Member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to stand in the House today and give the perspective of the constituents of Vancouver Kingsway to Bill C-13. I've read this bill, Mr. Speaker, and given a great deal of thought and analysis to it. And I'd like to point out a few things that come to my mind as some preliminary observations about the bill. First of all, I do think that the bill provides some positive measures. I think the bill also contains some negative measures. And I think most notably, from my analysis, the predominant feature of this bill is that it is marked by what it does not deal with, what it is silent on. In terms of some of the positive measures that are contained in this bill, I'd like to point out some of them and congratulate the government on picking up what I think are some policies that most Canadians would support. First off, this bill does offer partial loan forgiveness for family physicians, nurses, and nurse practitioners who begin practicing in underserved rural or remote areas. Now, this is a provision that I personally must stand in support in this House because it mirrors, in part, a private member's bill that I drafted a year and a half ago and moved in this very House, where I proposed a bill that would reward doctors, nurses, and nurse practitioners who serve in underserviced areas with a freeze on their Canadian student loans for the first 5 years of practice. And then for each year, from year 6 through 10, they would have their loan erased at the rate of 20% per year, meaning that rural and underserviced areas in our healthcare system, in terms of family doctors, nurses, and nurse practitioners, would be able to get that very important service, and people who practiced in those areas would be able to have their federal loans forgiven as a result of that commitment. This bill also introduces a family caregiver tax credit for caregivers of infirm dependents. Once again, I think that's a positive measure, although, as has been pointed out by many experts in the tax field in this country, this government is moving towards increasing reliance on the use of tax credits, and that reflects a certain philosophy of delivering government programs that is not without its problems. Most notably, it requires Canadian families to lay out the money first and then claim a tax credit much later. And for millions of Canadians, that's simply not a reality. For millions of Canadian families, they simply don't have that money to lay out at first, and so tax credits are of limited utility. The bill also provides a temporary measure to refund a portion of employer premiums for small business. Now, this is, I think, truly a case of giving with one hand and taking away with the other. Although, of course, one must support a measure that would refund a portion of EI premiums for both employers and workers in this challenged economic time. On the other hand, we must also remember that it was this government that is raising EI premiums starting in January by the tune of $2 billion per year. Now, I think that taking back some money that, or giving businesses the ability to save some money after having their overall premiums raised, I think is a cynical approach to politics that Canadians should be aware of. Also, Canadians must always remember when we talk about EI that the EI surplus of over $50 billion, the premiums paid by the businesses of this country and the workers of this country to create an insurance fund for them to draw on in their times of high unemployment, which, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, we are experiencing right now in Canada, and taking that money and just putting it into general revenue is still an unredressed problem that I think is crying out for redress. Now, I also would point out that this bill also expands the eligibility for accelerated capital cost allowance for clean energy generation and conservation equipment, and again, I think that's a positive measure. However, in the grand scheme of things, and as I see my colleague from Halifax is here, who has done wonderful work on the environment file, I'm sure she would point out to this House, and has been pointing out day after day in this House, is that this measure is really a drop in the ocean in terms of what Canada must do in terms of clean energy creation and environmental protection in this country. Now, in terms of some of the negative things in this bill, as we've heard, proposes to end the per-vote subsidy for political parties that receive more than a certain percentage of the vote. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's more than 5% of the vote. Now, this, Mr. Speaker, in my view, is a regressive policy, and it amounts to poor public policy at the same time. Canada has, I think, created what can be, I think, fairly regarded as one of the finest and fairest election finance systems in the world. Canadians want an electoral system that is fair and is controlled by the citizens of our country. Now, the features of our federal campaign and electoral finance system are as follows. We have put in measures that limit the contributions of any one person in this country to $1,100. So that takes big money out of politics. It has eliminated donations entirely from corporations and trade unions. So it has taken the influence of I don't want to say persons because they're persons, non-individuals out of politics. It has set spending limits in terms of what we can spend in a particular riding in an election and what we can spend nationally in the campaign, so it evens the playing field and it takes, again, big money out of our political system. In short, Mr. Speaker, it's a system that enshrines the concept of democracy run by people, paid for by people, and to serve the people. And Canadians, of course, have a great interest in democracy. Democracy is not free. A democratic system must be paid for. But a democracy that is paid for by the public means that we don't have a democracy that is bought and paid for by private interests. And I think that's what Canadians want. They want a publicly financed democracy, not a privately financed democracy.